When you think of the states that pride themselves on independence, self-reliance, and limited government, which ones come to mind? Chances are you picture places like the American South or maybe the Great Plains, states that reliably vote Republican, often called Red America. These are the states that elect politicians promising smaller government, lower taxes, and less spending on welfare. In the American imagination, they embody rugged individualism. The idea that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you don't rely on Washington for help. But here's the paradox. What if I told you these same states, the very ones most hostile to the idea of a so-called welfare state, are the biggest recipients of federal money? That for every dollar they pay into the federal treasury, they often receive $1.50, sometimes $2 back in federal spending. Meanwhile, many of the states we think of as blue America, places like California, New York, New Jersey, states that are often accused of big spending and liberal dependency, are actually the ones footing the bill. They pay more into the system than they get back, effectively subsidizing the states that criticize government spending the loudest. Take Mississippi, for example, and we're going to repeatedly throughout this video. It's one of the most reliably Republican states in the nation. Yet, for every dollar Mississippians pay in federal taxes, the state receives nearly double in return. Compare that to New Jersey, a solidly Democratic state, which sends far more to Washington than it ever sees. Or California, home to Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and a massive tax base. California subsidizes federal programs that keep rural hospitals running in places like Alabama and West Virginia. States that often vote to slash those very programs. This is more than just an odd budget quirk. It raises uncomfortable questions about ideology versus reality. How can regions that most depend on federal dollars be the same ones demanding that government shrink? How do we reconcile the politics of self-reliance with the economics of dependence? And perhaps most importantly, what does this contradiction tell us about the American Union itself? About how we share resources, how we imagine fairness, and how we define what it means to be independent? That's the journey we're going to take together in this video. We'll look at the history of the federal safety net. We'll break down where the money actually goes. And we'll explore why the politics and the economics don't always line up. By the end, you might see the so-called welfare state in a very different light. And maybe you'll understand why the loudest critics of government are often its biggest beneficiaries. To understand how we got here, how the states that rail against big government often depend on it the most, we have to step back and look at history of the federal aid in America. The story really begins in the depths of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, after the stock market crash and the collapse of banks, unemployment soared and millions of Americans faced hunger and homelessness. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal changed the relationship between citizens and the federal government forever. It wasn't perfect, but it planted the seeds of the safety net we still rely on today. Programs like Social Security gave the elderly a guaranteed income in retirement for the first time in American history. Before that, if you grew too old to work, you often depended entirely on family, charity, or, you guessed it, the county poorhouse. Unemployment insurance gave workers temporary support when jobs disappeared. Farm subsidies stabilized agricultural markets, so farmers, many of them in what are now deep red states, could keep producing food without being ruined by price swings or tariff wars. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, a New Deal, big government, deep state project, brought electricity and an economic development to some of the poorest, most rural parts of the South. That's federal aid at work, right in the heart of what would later become Republican strongholds. Fast forward to the 1960s, and you see another wave of expansion under Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. Medicare and Medicaid were born, providing health coverage for seniors and low-income Americans. Food stamps, now known as SNAP, became permanent. Federal aid to education grew, and importantly, disaster relief became institutionalized, with Washington stepping in after floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes. If you look at a map of natural disasters, it's clear. Much of the money flows to southern and midwestern states. Again, regions today that lean Republican, heavily. Now, how did people respond politically? At first, many Americans welcome these programs. When you're in the middle of the Dust Bowl, or when your crops have failed for the third year in a row, a government check isn't a political question, it's survival. But over time, as prosperity returned, especially after World War II, a different rhetoric began to take hold. In the South, and in rural America more broadly, the language of small government and self-reliance became powerful cultural touchstones. There were reasons for this. Some of it was about economics. Farmers and small business owners didn't want heavy federal regulation. Some of it was about race. The backlash against desegregation and civil rights often got wrapped in the language of states' rights and limited government. And some of it was about identity. The idea that independence and toughness defined what it meant to be an American, especially outside the big cities. So by the late 20th century, you had this fascinating split. On the one hand, programs like Social Security, Medicare, farm subsidies, and disaster aid were widely popular in red America. In fact, many voters depended on them. On the other hand, the political rhetoric in those same regions was increasingly hostile to the very idea of a federal safety net. Politicians could score points by attacking big government in Washington, even as their constituents cashed checks from the same government. And that tension between the history of aid and the politics of resistance set the stage for the paradox we see today. When we trace it back, the irony is clear. The very regions that leaned on the New Deal and Great Society programs to climb out of poverty are often the same regions now most hostile to the word welfare. But the history reminds us, federal aid isn't abstract. It builds dams and power plants. It keeps farmers afloat. It keeps hospitals open. And without it, much of rural America wouldn't look the way it does today. And it looks good compared to how it would have looked without it. Now that we've traced the history of how the safety net grew, let's turn to the present. Why is it that so many red states, the ones that vote reliably Republican, end up receiving more federal dollars than they contribute in taxes? The answer isn't simple, but when you break it down, there are some very clear patterns. First, demographics. Red states tend to have older populations compared to many blue states. Seniors draw heavily on Social Security and Medicare. Those programs aren't handouts. People pay into them during their working years. But the reality is, states with larger elderly populations pull more money back out of the federal system. That's one of the reasons why Florida, though a politically mixed state, receives so much federal support. In the Deep South, in places like Mississippi or Alabama, the combination of older population and widespread poverty means a bigger share of people depend on Social Security checks or Medicare coverage just to get by. Add to that the rural factor. Rural communities have smaller tax bases, fewer large employers, and often lower wages. They simply don't generate the same tax revenue as wealthy urbanized states like California or New York. But those rural communities still need schools, roads, hospitals, postal service, electricity grids, and now broadband. The cost of providing those services doesn't shrink just because the population is small. In fact, it's often more expensive per person to maintain infrastructure in rural areas. And so, federal dollars flow in to fill the gap. Second, economics. Many red states depend heavily on sectors that are subsidized or supported by Washington. Agriculture is the clearest example. Farm subsidies are built into the federal budget, And they overwhelmingly benefit rural agricultural states, the very places that form the backbone of the Republican voting map. Whether it's price supports for crops like corn and soybeans in the Midwest, or disaster payments when hurricanes wipe out cotton and rice in the South. These programs are lifelines. Without them, family farms would vanish overnight. Another big factor is military spending. Many red states host large military bases. Think of Texas, North Carolina, Georgia. Defense contracts pour billions of dollars into these states, propping up the local economies. Now, it's not framed as welfare, of course. It's framed as national security, but from an economic standpoint, it's still federal money creating jobs and supporting communities. Then there's federal contracting more broadly. States like Alabama and Mississippi, and we're going to return to those two a lot, rely on defense contractors and aerospace companies that receive huge federal subsidies. West Virginia has long relied on federal mine safety programs and energy support. These dollars aren't classified as welfare, but they're part of the same redistributive system. Wealthier, high-tax states fund projects in states with lower revenue. Third, social programs. Let's look at the programs that are often derided as welfare. Medicaid, for instance. It's one of the largest sources of federal spending in red states, especially in the South, where the poverty rates are higher, and private insurance is harder to afford. Social Security is another big one. Even in states that don't generate a lot of income tax revenue, residents are drawing checks every month. Programs like SNAP, food stamps, disproportionately support households in poorer states, which again tend to be in the Republican column. Add in disaster relief, hurricanes in the Gulf, tornadoes in the Midwest, floods in Appalachia. And it's no surprise that federal emergency funds often flow to red states. Now let's ground this in some examples. Again, take Mississippi. Not picking on you specifically. It's consistently at or near the bottom in national rankings for income or education. But it's at the top when it comes to federal aid received per dollar paid in taxes. Alabama is in a similar situation. Relatively low wages, high poverty, heavy reliance on programs like Medicaid and food assistance. West Virginia, a state built on coal mining, has seen decades of economic decline, leaving many residents dependent on disability benefits, Medicare, or federal health programs. Arkansas has one of the highest rates of SNAP usage in the country. These aren't outliers. They're representative of a broader pattern. And here's where the paradox sharpens. The political rhetoric in these states is consistently anti-welfare, anti-big government. Politicians campaign on cutting spending, shrinking Washington, and restoring self-reliance. The image of the hard-working, independent American who doesn't want a government handout is deeply ingrained. Yet the economic reality is that these states rely on government spending to survive, whether through farm subsidies, military contracts, healthcare programs, or former disaster relief. This isn't about hypocrisy on an individual level, and I'm not wealth-shaming these states. Most people cashing Social Security checks or relying on SNAP benefits aren't making ideological statements. They're just trying to live. The contradiction comes at the political level. Leaders denounce big government while simultaneously lobbying for more federal dollars for their states. Senators rail against spending in one breath and boast about securing federal contracts or disaster aid in the next. And this is why the red state dependence isn't just an accounting quirk. It's a central feature of American politics today. The loudest voices against federal spending often come from the places that benefit from it the most. It's not that people in red states don't value federal aid. They depend on it. It's that politically, the story of self-reliance sells better than the story of dependence. And that tension between identity and economics is the beating heart of the paradox. So far, we've looked at why red states rely so heavily on federal support. But to see the full picture, we need to turn the map around and look at the states that do the opposite, the ones that consistently pay more into the federal system than they get back. And here's where things get really interesting. Those states are overwhelmingly blue. Let's name a few: California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Illinois, Minnesota. These are the states that year after year send billions more in federal taxes than they receive in direct spending. For example, in a typical year, New Jersey residents might send $1 to Washington and get back 70 or 80 cents. California, despite being the fifth largest economy in the world, actually runs a federal loss. Its taxpayers contribute vastly more than what the state gets back in direct programs or aid. And New York, it routinely subsidizes federal spending to the tune of billions of dollars each year. Why does this happen? Well, a few reasons stand out. First, income levels. Blue states tend to have higher average incomes. They're home to major urban centers, where salaries, property values, and profits are simply bigger. Federal income taxes are progressive, which means wealthier people and wealthier regions contribute more. So the sheer economic power of New York City, the Silicon Valley, Boston, or Chicago translates into higher tax revenues flowing to Washington. Second, density. Urban states not only have wealthier populations, but also more people packed into smaller spaces. That concentration magnifies economic activity. A single city block in Manhattan or San Francisco might generate more taxable revenue in a year than some rural counties generate in a decade. That tax base becomes a steady stream of federal income that Washington can redistribute. Third, corporate presence. Blue states are home to the headquarters of multinational corporations, banks, tech giants, and financial institutions. Think Wall Street in New York or Silicon Valley in California, or the biotech and pharmaceutical hubs in Massachusetts and New Jersey. These corporations pay corporate taxes. Their executives and employees pay personal income taxes, and their profits are counted in the national economy. Again, all of this drives up the amount blue states send to Washington. Now, you might expect that with all this money flowing in, the states that would get their fair share back. But that's not how the federal system works. The federal budget redistributes resources based on need, not on contribution, which means states with higher poverty, more rural infrastructure needs, or greater dependence on agriculture or military spending often draw more money out than they put in. Because, we're a big family and we share amongst ourselves. In practice, that means blue states end up subsidizing red states, and that's fine. But here's where the irony comes in. California tax dollars help keep hospitals open in Alabama. New York dollars pay for the farm subsidies in Iowa. New Jersey taxpayers fund Medicaid expansion in Kentucky. The very states that often vote for politicians promising to shrink federal spending are being carried, in part, by the wealth generated in blue states, the very places those same politicians like to mock as bloated, liberal, or out of touch. Now, that's not to say blue states don't benefit from federal spending at all. Of course they do. Every state does. Federal agencies, research grants, transportation funding, disaster relief, they reach everywhere. But in the balance sheet, the flow of money is unmistakable. Wealth moves from urbanized, higher income, heavily blue states to rural, lower income, heavily red states. And this creates a striking paradox. On the campaign trail, you'll hear slogans about hardworking taxpayers in red America footing the bill for liberal programs in California or New York. But the reality is the opposite. The financial engines of blue America are the ones underwriting the social safety net that sustains large parts of red America. It's the classic case of ideology running headfirst into arithmetic. Now, this is where the paradox becomes political theater. We've seen that red states receive more federal dollars than they pay in, and that blue states effectively subsidize the system. So you might expect that voters in red states would be the strongest defenders of federal programs. They're benefiting the most, right? The loudest voice is saying, don't cut Social Security, don't touch Medicare, don't gut farm subsidies or disaster relief. Oh wait, too late. And in fact, at the individual level, that is often the case. Poll after poll shows that conservative voters strongly support these specific programs. Very few people want Medicare cuts, or their farm subsidies eliminated, or Social Security checks reduced. But at the political level, things flip. Campaigns in red states rarely emphasize the dollars flowing in from Washington. Instead, they focus on rhetoric about independence, about small government, about the dangers of the so-called welfare state. The narrative of self-reliance is so powerful that it overrides the basic math of who benefits the most from government spending. And so, year after year, politicians are elected on platforms that, if actually implemented, would strip their own states of critical support. Like we're already seeing. Take Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. In many red states, like Texas, governors and legislatures resisted expanding Medicaid, even though it would have brought billions in federal dollars directly into their healthcare systems. The refusal wasn't about arithmetic. The money was there, fully funded by Washington in the early years. It was about ideology. Expanding Medicaid meant admitting dependence on a federal program tied to Obamacare, a toxic name in conservative politics. Even though everybody loves the Affordable Care Act, right? The result, rural hospitals closed, people lost access to care. And yet politically, leaders were rewarded for holding the ideological line. Or look at disaster relief. Every time a hurricane devastates the Gulf Coast or tornadoes tear through the Midwest, senators and representatives from those regions rush to demand federal aid, and they usually got it. Of course, FEMA's been gutted. But when the disasters strike elsewhere, some of those same voices vote against relief packages. After Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast in 2012, many Republican lawmakers from red states opposed the aid package, even though they themselves routinely advocate for disaster funds after storms in their own districts. Same thing with wildfires in California. The contradiction is staggering. Oppose it in principle, but demand it in practice. Even farm subsidies tell a similar story. Politicians talk about cutting government spending and ending handouts, but they almost never touch agricultural subsidies, because doing so would devastate their rural voting base. Like tariffs do. So the rhetoric is broad. Washington spends too much, but the reality is selective. Cuts are imagined for someone else, somewhere else, never the programs that sustain their own communities. This is why the paradox is so politically sticky. The narrative of small government has become a cultural identity in red America. It's not just a policy preference. It's a marker of values, of who you are and what you stand for. And once identity gets wrapped in politics, facts and figures matter less. People can hold two seemingly contradictory beliefs at once: that government is too big, and that their Social Security, their Medicare, their disaster relief, their farm supports should remain untouched. To call that hypocrisy misses the point. It's more about how ideology and identity shape the way we talk about government, even when the economic reality points in the opposite direction. And here's the key. Politicians understand this paradox and exploit it. They run on the promise of small government. They know full well that many of their constituents depend on big government. They don't have to resolve the contradiction. They just have to speak to the identity. And in American politics today, identity often wins over reality. So, what happens when you take this paradox that red states often depend more on federal dollars while opposing the very idea of federal support, and follow it out into the real world? The consequences ripple through society, the economy, and our culture in ways that shape American politics every single day. First, let's look at the people's lives on the ground. Most of the states that are most dependent on federal aid have higher rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, and more limited access to health care. For example, states in the Deep South or Appalachia consistently rank near the bottom in metrics for life expectancy, child mortality, and access to mental health services. These are precisely the kinds of gaps that federal programs, Medicaid expansion, SNAP benefits, subsidized healthcare marketplaces, are designed to address. Yet, because of political opposition, some of these states either reject the programs outright, Texas, or underfund their implementation. The result is a kind of double bind. Communities most in need of support are the least likely to get it fully, not because Washington refuses, but because their own state leadership often says no on principle. Now let's shift to the dollars and cents. The redistribution of wealth between states is not a side effect. It's a fundamental feature of how the federal government works. Higher income states like California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois generate large surpluses in federal revenue. That money doesn't just sit in Washington. It flows outward, supporting everything from farm subsidies in Iowa to military bases in Kentucky. In effect, the blue states subsidize the cost of living, infrastructure, and public services in red states. And here's the irony. When politicians from those red states rail against big government spending, they're often railing against the very mechanism that makes their state budgets possible. Without those federal transfers, many red states would be forced to raise taxes or slash services just to keep the lights on. And between those two, we know which one they'd choose. But maybe the most powerful and dangerous consequence is cultural. For decades, the idea of self-reliance has been elevated to a moral virtue in much of red America. The story goes, we work hard. We don't need handouts. We don't want Washington telling us what to do. And yet, the economic reality shows that these regions are deeply intertwined with and dependent on the federal government. This contradiction fuels resentment and polarization. Blue states often look at the map and say, we're paying your bills, so why do you call us freeloaders? Meanwhile, red states cling to the narrative of independence, even as their communities benefit from the very system they denounce. This cultural clash between the myth of self-reliance and the reality of interdependence is one of the engines driving modern American polarization. And so we arrive at the big picture. The United States is, by design, a system of shared risk and shared resources. But when the rhetoric doesn't line up with reality, trust erodes. People begin to see federal spending not as a collective investment, but as a redistribution. Someone else's money being taken to support people over there. That's where the resentment deepens, and where political battles become less about policy and more about identity. So let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Throughout this discussion, one paradox has kept resurfacing. The states that most loudly demand smaller government and less spending are often the very ones most dependent on federal support. Meanwhile, the states that accept the role of government more readily are often the ones footing a disproportionate share of the bill. This contradiction isn't just a quirk in the budget or a set of curious statistics. It's a window into the deeper disconnect between political ideology and economic reality in America. And it forces us to ask a hard question. How sustainable is a system where the stories we tell about ourselves are so often at odds with the facts of how we live? Think about it. If federal redistribution disappeared tomorrow, some states would struggle to keep the lights on, while others would barely feel the impact. If self-reliance were truly put to the test, the results would surprise many of the people who champion it most fiercely. But here's the takeaway. Red or blue, urban or rural, coastal or inland. We're part of the same interconnected economy. No state, no community, no person thrives entirely on their own. No one is an island. The roads, the schools, the hospitals, the farms, the businesses, they all exist within a national web of support. So maybe the real challenge for us isn't about dismantling the safety net or doubling down on the myth of self-reliance. Maybe it's about admitting the truth, that interdependence is not weakness, it's reality. And the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start building a system that works not just in theory, but in practice for everyone. I'll leave you with this thought, blue or red. The truth is that we all live in the same house. The question is, do we want to keep tearing its walls down or start building a stronger foundation together?